I'm thrilled to introduce Glenn Gordinier for his talk about Captain Nat Palmer. Dr. Glenn Gordinier is the Robert G. Albion Historian at Mystic Seaport Museum. A museum staffer for 41 years, he directs the Munson Institute, has chaired dozens of conferences and symposia, taught the Summer Museum Studies course, served on the Williams Mystic faculty, and written numerous articles and books. He also directed the Role Players program for 10 years. His character, Captain Josiah Gardner, has performed on or in waters adjacent to 5 continents. So thank you, Glenn, for joining us today, and I will turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Arlene. It's a pleasure to be here back in what still is, I suppose, once COVID is behind us, our beautiful classroom. And I thank you, Arlene, for being a part of this, and my other colleagues I see in the room making this all happen, the Zoom presentation and all the rest. So it really is a pleasure to be here. But let's jump right in here and talk about Captain Nat Palmer, from Stonington to Antarctica and the world. And I'll push a button and see if it's the one that works. It does. So let's talk about Nat Palmer's world. Born in August of 1799, this became his world. This also was part of his world. And of course, we're here today because this was a part of his world as well. But let's come a little closer to home. His home waters would be the waters of southern New England. And as we get even closer, we get Block Island Sound. We come even closer, we move into Fisher's Island Sound, and we begin to see his home village of Stonington. Born in the borough, he was a Stonington native, right in the middle of the village down on Water Street, at the corner, for those who are relatively local, at the corner of Water and Harmony Streets. And this is the way the village looks today from the air, looking from the east to the west. That's the Connecticut coast going up there. You can see some of the water line here. And then if we look as it appeared in the 19th century, we can see, let me give another push to my button. We can see how the village looked from the opposite direction. Now we're looking from west to east, and there we see Stonington Borough, about a half-mile long, this peninsular town, surrounded by water on 3 sides. And as they say, Nat Palmer was born here. This is the home he was born in. But interestingly enough, this is not the home he would recognize, because when he was born here, it looked much more like this. It was a Yankee salt box. Its outside appearance changed to a Georgian mansion back in the 1980s. Which is not to say there weren't other mansions in the village. There were many other mansions in the village. Here are some other lovely buildings in Stonington Borough. Greek Revival kind of predominates in many of these lovely homes, because it was during the Greek Revival era, 1820 to 1860, that Stonington, like most of maritime America, thrived. And what we see today is the remnant of that, with beautiful architecture. We have our fishing fleet, we have our beautiful lighthouse, lots of reasons to just really sense the connection with the sea in Stonington Borough. Now, a map looking down on the village, and again, surrounded by the sea on all 3 sides. What did that mean to Nat Palmer, young Nat Palmer, and his peers? Well, we can get a feel for that looking at other small New England seaports. This is a bird's eye view of Beverly, Massachusetts, up on the North Shore of Massachusetts, north of Boston. And one of the residents there, child born there, was Lucy Larcom. She may be familiar to you as an American teacher, a poet, and author. She published one of the best-known accounts of New England childhood called A New England Girlhood, talking about her native Massachusetts. This is what she wrote, and we could apply this to Stonington certainly. Quote, "The sea was its nearest neighbor and penetrated every fireside, claiming intimacy with every home and heart. Every third man you met on the street you hailed as shipmate or skipper or captain. The women of well-to-do families had Canton crepe shawls and Smyrna silks and Turk satins for Sabbath day wear, which somebody had brought home for them. We were accustomed to seeing barrels full of coconuts rolled about, and there were jars of preserved tropical fruits, tamarinds, ginger root, and other spicy appetizers, almost as common as barberries and cranberries in the cupboards of most housekeepers. We had all kinds of strange foreign coins mixed in with our large copper cents. And we also had wanderers from foreign countries, domesticated in many families. So that's one small village. Here's the word from another small village, another man who grew up during this time, John Whiddon. His hometown was Marblehead, and here's what he wrote. Marblehead, being a seaport town, my time when not in school or doing chores was spent with my companions about the wharves, climbing aboard the vessels or rowing around the docks. What a treat for us boys when a square rigger came sailing into the harbor. How we swarmed on board, exploring every nook and cranny, daring each other to mount higher and higher until I, looking down, saw the admiring but envious gaze of my young companions. Then again, to sit in the forecastle and hear the sailors spin their yarns was happiness indeed. To go to sea, visit foreign lands, and in time become the captain of a fine ship. This was the goal to be looked forward to, the great aim of our lives. And there were thousands of young men along the coast that had the same aim. And we don't just have to look at anecdotal evidence like this. We can look at scholarship, and here are 3 books that looked at the communities along the coast of New England and determined that if you grew up a young man and you grew up here, you tended to go to sea. That's what your grandfather did, your father did, and this is how you could gain a competency, which is the term they use for enough resources, financial resources, to attract a mate and to start a family. So very common, both in the evidence we see from the past and from present scholarship. We might have read the same thing about Stonington Borough, and that Palmer grew up in the waterfront of Stonington, especially in his father's shipyard, which, in the words of Herman Melville, like Ishmael's whale ship, was, quote, his Yale College and his Harvard. So young Nat grew up, but all of this was interrupted with the War of 1812 when America declared war on Great Britain and the mightiest navy in the world. And that war, of course, came to the doorstep of Stonington. Lots of evidence still in the borough today. Here are the 2 cannons that defended the village against 160 British cannon and 5 vessels of war, a successful defense, unique in American history. But Nat Palmer wasn't here for that. He was out running the blockade. He was in coastal trade, trying to make his way through the British fleet to keep the economy going. That's where he was. When the war came to an end, he carried on in the coastal trade and sailed in and out of Stonington, going to ports up and down the East Coast, until he came back at the end of a voyage where he was sailing under his uncle, Peleg Brown, and he found out that a brig was in the village and was fitting out for a distant voyage. This was a 68-foot-long vessel commanded by Captain James Pendleton Sheffield, and she was bound for the Falkland Islands. Sheffield invited young Palmer to be second mate on this vessel. Mr. Palmer he would be. The problem was they were leaving in only 2 days. Was he up to the challenge? And of course, young Nat Palmer was. So 2 days later, the Hercilia was bound out. By the way, she was owned by 8 different people, owned shares in her. All of them were local men. On board were 20 souls, including Mr. Nathaniel Palmer. They were going looking for this. They had heard about fur seals in the deep South Atlantic, and so this was their goal, to find these things and harvest their pelts. Off they went, sailing all the way down to the Falkland Islands. If you've been watching The Crown lately, you'll see that that's the latest thing that's happening with the war on the Falkland Islands, the Maldives, as the Argentines call it. And they came into Berkeley Sound, which, if you look at this image, sort of at 1:30 o'clock, right up there near the right corner, you'll see the sign that says Berkeley Sound. They sailed in there, the Hercilia did, and having gotten there, dropped off 3 men, Nathaniel Palmer and 2 crew members. They left them on this island in the middle of the sound called Kidney Island, and their task was to hunt cattle that had been colonized by passing British vessels and gather seabird eggs. And so they did. Meanwhile, Captain Sheffield sailed to the east in search of the Aurora Islands and their rich seal rookeries. About a month after he'd been dropped off, another vessel appears. Her name is the Espiritu Santo of Buenos Aires. Palmer decides to talk with them, and he actually cuts a deal where he decides he can provide them meat and eggs as well. There was plenty to go around. It didn't interrupt what he was doing for his own men. But from the first mate of the Espiritu Santo, he learns of the South Shetland Islands, further to the south and to the west, another place to look for seals. When the Hercilia returns, he tells Captain Sheffield about it. There were, by the way, no Aurora Islands. They don't exist, so they're out there banging around for no reason. But he learns about, the captain learns about these islands, which do exist, and off they go, arriving at Ragged Island, also called Rugged Island, where they drop the hook in 8 fathoms with a sandy bottom, and right there in the harbor also was Espiritu Santo. I can only guess that that crew was not particularly happy to see these Yankees arrive. And so there they were, and they spent the better part of 2 weeks hunting seal. And it's not a difficult task. The seals all colonize the beaches. You can just walk up, whack them on the head, and kill the poor beastie, and then strip them of their pelts. Today we would be appalled. People are appalled by this sort of behavior. But you have to remember, folks, that at this period, every creature you ate had been whacked or cut or neck twisted and then stripped of its pelt or its feathers or whatever. So this sort of what we would call butchery was commonplace. The thing that was different was the scale of this, and I'll refer to that in a bit. But to strip an animal of its skin, that was a standard operating procedure with the technologies of the day. It didn't take too long for them to accomplish their goal, and by the 3rd week of May, they were back in Stonington. And this was the first American voyage to Antarctica. No one had done this other than the Stonington boys. The pelts were worth $22,000, a small fortune. And that was really wonderful to be home. But William Fanning, who organized this, began the very next day to plan for the next season and what he called their South Seas concern. When that next season rolled around, there were 5 vessels that had been organized. There was the brig Frederick, Captain Pendleton, the tender schooner Free Gift, Captain Thomas Dunbar of Westerly in command, another local man. These are all local guys. They're all Stonington guys except for Dunbar, who's, across that 50-foot bridge on the Rhode Island shore. Then the schooner Express, Ephraim Williams, the brig Hercilia with Captain Sheffield again. And then the 5th of the vessels was the tender sloop Hero. And when I say tender, we've got the one schooner and the one sloop. They don't hunt for the seals, but they provide the other vessels. They carry the pelts back to the station where they're organizing. They carry supplies out to the men on the beaches and the rocks. And so 2 vessels doing that. One, the sloop Hero, 47 tons, commanded by 20-year-old Captain Nathaniel Palmer. So off they're going to head. Here's some documentation. This shows the list of the vessels and the number of people on board. It says 90 on board. This one we've got to study a little closely because we see at the bottom of the list it says Hero, 7 people, but not in fact true. Only 5 men were on board the Hero, the captain included. Here's another piece of documentation. This is the registration. When the Hero moved from the coastal trade to sailing to foreign waters, she had to redocument. Just like you register your car, the local customs house documents the Hero to be permitted to go to foreign waters. And so here we see that document as well. Helps us in our historical research. The most important document is this, the log that Captain Palmer kept. The original is in the Library of Congress, but here locally, Stonington Historical Society included, we have a high-quality photocopy. And so we're looking here at the cover of it, which says the Seaman's Journal, being as easy and correct method of keeping the ship's reckoning, keeping the daily reckoning of a ship during the course of her voyage. And these sorts of things were printed up. They had standard layouts. Let's take a look on the inside. Here's the standard layout for a ship's log. On the left-hand column, we have the hour of the day. The first hour, by the way, begins at noon, something we have to keep in mind. The meridian, when the sun's at its highest, that's when the day begins when you're at sea. And we can see that column goes 12 hours till midnight and then starts over again at 1 a.m. until noon the next day. And we see on this particular page, the wind was blowing 7 knots, then 5 knots, then 4, 4, 4, then 1, 1, 1, then 2, then 3. So light wind getting lighter and lighter, very frustrating for a captain and his crew. And then a little pickup. Then we go to the next column over in the course. We're going south and east by east, then south-southeast. We can all the way down, and then once the column doesn't change, they keep the same course. And we can work our way across where the winds are coming from. And then there's a big section for comments where you report on what's going on, particularly the weather details. Down at the bottom, we see latitude and longitude, all that sort of thing. This is the official legal record of the voyage. And so it's always kept very carefully. If there's going to be any lawsuits, any damage to cargo, whatever it might be, you always want this record, very important. It's not the same as the other sort of record we find at places like Mystic Seaport, Blunt White Library, and the Stonington Historical. This is a ship's journal, actually a personal journal. And there are hundreds and thousands of these scattered around in libraries and museums around the country. A journal is much more informal. It's a personal record. It might include the navigational data, observations, and all of that, but also will include personal observations. And that's why these journals are so rich. Some logs are sort of a little bit of both, and that's kind of what we find in Palmer's log. But here we see the day of departure, July 30th, 1820. We are headed to what will eventually take us to Antarctica. At 11 a.m., got underway and proceeded to sea. At meridian, cleared the reef. So, at the start of the official day, they clear Watch Hill Reef that runs there between Fisher's Island East End and over to Watch Hill Light. They cleared the reef in company with Express and Hercelia. So 3 vessels departing Stonington together on that day. And Nat Palmer now in command. Who's he in command of? Well, let's take a moment and consider who was on board the crew of Hero. And I'm going to turn to this famous painting. This is America's first genre painting, America's first action shot, so to speak. Up until this time, they were all portraits or religious images or something like that. But here we have John Singleton Copley, famous Boston artist. Then he goes back to good old jolly England. But Copley was asked by a fellow named James Watson to paint the moment where his life changed. James Watson was a young British mariner, 14 years old, on a voyage to Havana. When swimming in Havana Harbor, a shark came along, took off his leg. And then years later, a very successful man, the Lord High Mayor of the City of London, and that's when he commissioned Copley to paint this life-changing instance. And he was very careful about what he told Copley to paint. He wanted to be exactly what he remembered. So we're going to take this image and we're going to shorten it down from a larger crew to a smaller crew-ish. And who do we have on board? First, Captain Nat Palmer, 20 years old, young guy like the one we see at the bow perhaps. First mate, Phineas Wilcox, 28 years old, 7 years Palmer senior. He'd also been masters of vessels himself. That's quite a compliment to Palmer. Second mate, Richard Fanning Loper, local names again. These are all local names, 21 years old. Then 2 deckhands, Stanton Burdick, 16 years old, Peter Harvey, 31, of Philadelphia. Harvey, just like we see this image from Havana Harbor, a man of color, an African American. This was the best opportunity for a man of color in America to get equal work for equal pay. No more last hired, first fired. You stay as long as the voyage lasts. A good way to make a living and gain a competency for a class of people that were excluded from the American economy otherwise. But that's our crew on board the Hero. Off we go. We sail on south, and we reach the South Shetlands without a problem. Uneventful voyage, essentially. And they come into this spot down here in the corner. Here on November 12th, commenced with thick weather, fresh breeze from the north by east at 4 p.m., saw Castle Rock, stood in for Ragged Island. And if we look at this particular map, we look all the way down to the lower left at about 7 o'clock, and you'll see there's a tiny island there where it says Castle Rock. That was the first sighting they had. They made their way there directly to the east, and up inside you can see up inside Lord's or Rugged Island, a little anchor in the water. That's the anchoring grounds. That's why that anchor's there, to show this is a place to come to a safe anchorage. And so they did. The log goes on. 8, being at the mouth of the harbor, we were boarded by a boat from the Hercelia. Captain shuffled. And what they found was over the next couple of days, the whole squadron had gotten together and they were having meetings to organize their activities down here so they could go after seals. What Palmer learned, was that the Free Gift, that other kind of support vessel, had already sailed to the east over toward Deception Island. You can see Deception Island, that little sort of croissant-looking island there. But all the way along the coast and out to Deception, no seals had been discovered. So Palmer was charged with going further. And off Palmer goes. Here we see a map that talks about this, written by a fellow for the Log of Mystic Seaport. Thomas Stevens made this map in an article he wrote about Palmer's expeditions. And here we see the log. This is the log of the voyage. And we're looking at Wednesday, November 15th. These 24 hours commenced with thick weather. So at noontime, thick weather, kind of foggy. Light breeze from the northwest, cleared off, got underway on a cruise, stood for Deception. Of course, by east. So off they go. I won't go into the details, but they're standing along the island, hopefully finding seals, but they don't see any seals, nor do they find a place where they can really kind of rest themselves. They actually lower a boat looking to see what they think is a harbor. Turns out it's not. They're disappointed. And as he says at the bottom, we're disappointed, stood along to the southward. And then he says, saw an opening, stood in, found it to be a spacious harbor. And this is a photograph of the opening he saw. And you can kind of see that opening in the chart there up above. Found very deep water, 50 and 60 fathoms, got out the boat to sound, found anchorage about 1.5 miles from the mouth. At 11 we came to, and 18 fathoms off the mouth of a lagoon. Went on shore and got some eggs, he says. So, of course, you don't just sail into a place like this you don't know. You lower a boat, and they go sounding. They check the depths and the currents and all that and report back before you commit your big vessel. They go in, they come ashore. This is all wonderful. And here's a nice image that shows the makeup of Deception Island and why it's so called. That gap, that narrow gap, takes you into a caldera. Deception Island is a volcano. It's still active, in fact. When we were there back in January, things were pretty quiet. But people have been chased out of there decades ago by volcanic activity. And other groups have gone down there and dug into the black sand and made themselves little sauna baths because the water gets so warm from the deep volcanic activity. In any case, you enter through what is now known as Neptune's Bellows. You can see that down there at 5 o'clock. And what Palmer had done was discover the finest protected harbor in all of Antarctica. That alone is an accomplishment, but he has more that he'll do. While we were there, and again, this was a wonderful voyage organized by Mystic Seaport in cooperation with Alexander and Kent explorers and the Ponant Ship Company. Richard Wallach was one of our speakers down there, so he and I got to share the good food and the adventure. It was really wonderful. But one of the things we did while we were in Deception Island, in the harbor, was we had brought along this wonderful piece of American history, Americana. This is what's known as a ditty box, a small handmade box in which a sailor would carry his personal gear. And if we look across the top, we can sort of make out, it says S.B. Stanton Burdick, Stonington, 1820, sloop Hero. This box actually was in this very harbor 200 years ago. It was wonderful. And so we celebrated that on board our beautiful vessel. And here we see in the back, you can see Steve White, CEO of Mystic Seaport. In front of him, his lovely wife, Maggie. The ship's captain down there on the left, a Frenchman of great skill. And then holding the box is one of Mystic Seaport's trustees. This is Alex Boulazel. And Alex deserves all sorts of credit. It was his idea years ago. He had hatched the idea that Mystic Seaport needs to be in Antarctica, in Deception Island, 200 years after Nathaniel Palmer. And so here we are celebrating this wonderful moment. It was just great. let's get back to Palmer. He eventually, when he's on shore, he wants to get a look at what's around him, and you can see the blue arrow points up to what we call Neptune's window. The bellows got him into the harbor, and Neptune's window will allow him to look out from the harbor. And here we see a photograph that I took when we were there. Here's a couple workboats that were used early in the 20th century, abandoned in the black sand, that volcanic sand. And I'm looking up toward Neptune's window. You can see that saddleback. Relative to the unscalable cliffs on either side, it looks low, but it is not low. It's quite high. And you can walk your way up to it, which we did. Here we are going up the black sand next to these cliffs. And when you get to the top, this is what you find. You are looking out to the south and the east toward what people come to realize is the continent of Antarctica. And the story goes that Nat Palmer, with extraordinary eyesight, his family claims, looked out on a clear day and saw something that looked like this. Way in the distance, about 50 miles away, roughly, and very low, but visible was this long line. And according to other accounts, this is where he saw, of course, from here, he doesn't know. Are these islands? What is this? He didn't know. All he knew is that a big, strong piece, or a long piece of land like this probably has seals on it. And so he's happy to follow that, and off he goes. So let's track his voyage. We're going to look at some detail. We'll move more quickly once we get beyond this. But Thursday, November 16th, commences with fresh breeze and northwest, cloudy at 2 p.m., got underway. And he doesn't just abandon the harbor, he looks around. He's here. Let's see if there are other anchorages, other safe places. So he doesn't actually leave the harbor for some hours. But that's the day that he gets underway at 10 a.m., which is late that day, actually moving into the 17th of November. We clear the harbor, stood over for the land, course southeast, 1/2 east. So he comes out and kind of targets his way down sort of to the lower corner of that image that shows the island there. And he comes down Friday, November 15th. These 24 hours commences with fresh breeze from the southwest, pleasant at 8 p.m., got over under the land. So now he's up near, he calls under the land, near what we now know to be continental Antarctica. The sea is filled with immense icebergs. At 4 a.m., made sail inshore and discovered a strait, tending south-southwest and north-northeast. It was literally filled with ice, and the shore inaccessible. So, where he is, and you can see in this chart, he's actually looking to the south-southeast. That's Orleans Channel. We can see that image. It identifies Orleans Channel, and it's full of this ice. And he's not going to take his wooden vessel in there. That's death for certain. So it's prudent, and that's the word he used. We thought it not prudent to venture in, so we bore away to the northward. And so what he does, as we see in that chart, he kind of makes his way along the coast, of course, spending the whole time, if not looking for icebergs, looking at the coast. Are there beaches? Are there seals? It turns out there are neither, just these cliffs and these walls of ice. We bore away to the northern and saw 2 small islands. You can see those islands there, Tower Island and Olin Island. Sails past those. Perpendicular, we stood across toward Friesland, which is the term they use for Livingston Island. We'll see that in a minute. So it was a brief encounter. I'll stay back with this for a moment. A brief encounter with Antarctica, but certainly the first by Americans. He was only the 3rd ship's master to see Antarctica. The Russians had discovered it, and the British had discovered it back in January of the same year. Of course, Palmer didn't know that. No one knew it because those guys really weren't home yet. At least the Russians weren't. So this was unknown territory and an amazing accomplishment by a man now just turning 21 in the deep South Seas. Saturday, November 18th, he's making his way back north, headed up toward some of the areas he had just departed. And if we look at this chart, we can see him heading north. He's left the mainland behind, zigzags his way around, and goes up into what is identified here as Yankee Sound. And then he pokes around in there. Of course, again, this is all new territory. It's dangerous to go to, but maybe he can find safe anchorage for his shipmates, his colleagues. And this whole page is full of him identifying reefs and harbors and places to be. So he's poking around, exploring. Of course, looking for seals, doesn't find any of those, but does find a safe anchorage. And that safe anchorage eventually becomes known as Yankee Harbor. And perhaps, I hope you can see this, folks, from where you are. You can see Yankee Sound, which, by the way, for people from southeastern Connecticut, about half again as long as Fisher's Island Sound, that strip of water between Friesland and Greenwich Island. And then halfway up there, you can see a little sign that says Yankee Harbor, a good protected harbor. So once again, Palmer has done great work for his colleagues to help protect them as they go from one spot to another. Eventually, all of the vessels come together, and they make their way to McFarland Sound up there, right where Palmer was, and then they continue the hunt. So there's plenty of seals up that way, and the slaughter continues, and slaughter is the proper word, to the point that it's time for Palmer to go look for more. So they send him south, and here we see a chart that shows him coming out of the South Shetlands and running all the way down along what is called Palmer Peninsula. Down below the Arctic Circle on our voyage, we were right down in those waters. It was really a joy to be covering this territory that he had covered. So we explored further south for a period of 2 weeks through the end of January, and then came back. And then in February, he's still being sent out to find opportunities for these Yankee sailors. In the first week of February, he's in familiar water there south of Livingston Island, south of Friesland, but he's fogged in, he's socked in by fog. It's 12:30 a.m. in the dark of night. He comes out to ring the ship's bell. Dong, he rings it. And then he hears another bell off in the distance. And then from the opposite side, he hears a third bell. His crew's freaking out. What's going on here? Is these spirits? What's happening? When the fog lifts, he finds this extraordinary situation where he is sitting between two Russian ships of war. He goes aboard the largest of them, the Rostock, and he finds that he is the guest of Fabian von Billinghausen, a Russian naval officer who led this amazing imperial expedition in search of Terra Australis, the fictive continent of the Deep South. This went from 1819 to 1821. His ship was the first to cross the Antarctic Circle since Captain Cook. Cook never saw Antarctica, but he was that far south. And Bellinghausen actually circumnavigated Antarctica. The first person to sight the Antarctic continent is this fellow. Just days or weeks later, the British guy named Bransfield did too. So Palmer tells a very colorful story about how the captain, later admiral, invites him on board, and he's just amazed at what this young Yankee boy did. Bellinghausen's rendition of the story is not quite so dramatic, but the point is they did meet, and there they are in Antarctic waters, sharing knowledge, sharing information. Palmer comes back. He arrives back in Stonington in May. They had a very successful season. The Stonington fleet alone had harvested 88,000 pelts, which would then be shipped to the global market, and many of them going to Asia, and most of them, I believe, being sent from New London or Stonington to New York, and from there into the global market. The Stonington boys also brought home 1,500 barrels of sea elephant oil, worth $10 a barrel, and because you get those sea elephants, you can kill them on the beach and then boil them out for their blubber. And so Palmer is back home. It's all been a good trip, lots of money made, but there is still the call of the Deep South, the song of the fur seal. And so off he goes again the next year, 6 vessels this time out of Stonington. It's he and Sheffield, Captain Sheffield again, and several other vessels, all looking for more sea lions. Or fur seals, not sea lions, fur seals, I should say. Down they go, and he goes further south again. In this exploration, he also hooked up with a British explorer character, a guy named George Powell, and the two of them went north and east and discovered another series of islands, the South Orkneys. And Powell went on shore, looked around, named the biggest of them Coronation Island, And Powell was kind of frustrated because his consort here, Palmer, never went ashore. And he just didn't seem to have any kind of imagination, according to Powell. But we have to keep in mind that Palmer had one task, and that was to find seals. There were no seals on the beaches of Coronation Island or others nearby, so he was doing his duty. He wanted to keep on moving and find product for his colleagues. But you can see he's covering lots of territory. That season was essentially a bust because so many seals had been killed. 250,000 had been killed the year before. And it was determined by James Waddell that between 1819 and 1821, over 400,000 seals were killed or starved for lack of parental care. A lot of this because of our friends out of Stonington. Again, it wasn't so much what they were doing, it was the scale of what they did without looking to the future. The hero sailed on. Palmer sailed on. And on this voyage, actually, came back and then left the fur seal trade and then went into sailing to places like the Caribbean and the Spanish mainland, the Spanish Main, the north coast of South America. Traded there for 4 or 5 years. While he did, he came in contact with this fellow. This is Simón Bolívar, the great liberator who freed much of the territory from the Spanish. And Palmer actually sailed down there, sometimes carrying troops and supplies to Simón Bolívar's efforts for South American independence. We get to the late 1820s, and Palmer is called back down to the land of the fur seal. He sails off with Benjamin Pendleton again, and another vessel, a third vessel, which is commanded by his younger brother, Alexander. So the two Pendleton brothers, or the two Palmer brothers and Pendleton go heading off. And one of the things they thought maybe was possible is that there were other islands further to the west. They don't find very many seals, but at the end of this venture, Pendleton returns home, but the two Palmer brothers in their two different vessels go sailing off west of the South Shetlands, looking for these other, what turns out to be fictional islands. They're down in the 50s and 60 latitudes, very high latitudes, cold. Late February into March, which is winter weather is setting in, and they are down there. And this must have just been extraordinary, bouncing around out there day in, day out, night in, night out, looking for land that could crush your hull. That's you're looking for the land, don't want to run into it. And they never found it. They just banged around until the crew was worn out, the vessels were wearing out. And someone else who was banging around with them was Nathaniel Palmer's 19-year-old wife, Eliza. This is incredible. Very early in American maritime experience for a wife to go to sea, particularly to go to these environs. And I just think of her down below aboard his brig, banging around day in and day out. Boy, she had grit. If anybody had grit, it was her. By the way, this is not her. This is a generic silhouette, but it represents her. We'll see her later. So that was kind of a bust. But the word was that if you went up to Juan Fernandez Islands, you could buy seal skins up there from the Penal Colony. So he goes sailing up there. He's got Eliza on board. And as he arrives at Juan Fernandez Island, he comes rowing ashore in the small boat. There's another Spanish vessel coming out, hollering at him, and he finally realizes that, well, he doesn't. He realizes when it's too late. They were telling him that the colony had been taken over by the prisoners. So he was captured, almost killed on the spot by these prisoners, but they realized that maybe he could be their way to safety. They demanded he take them to the mainland off of Juan Fernandez. Palmer convinced him he had to get back on his vessel first, then they could come out. And he got on board and he told Eliza, get into the cabinet in our cabin below. Don't make a word. Don't move. If you do, we're all dead, or worse. And so Eliza hid herself away. To make matters even more complicated, when the prisoners come out, the criminals come out, they've brought their women. There were women on board here at the island, and the women are going wild. They're screaming and hollering. And Palmer has no leverage other than he stands at the rail of his ship. He looks down, he says, those women go back on shore. or you don't come on my vessel. They took the women back, the men come on board, and miraculously, he landed them on mainland Chile without further incident. In fact, they thanked him at the end. Palmer comes back to an America which is quite full of itself. The oldest republic still today. No matter what's happening, we are still the oldest republic on the planet. Our democracy needs defending, people. I'll say that's enough of that. But we have all sorts of other things. Western exploration, Davy Crockett, Emily Dickinson, voting by the large republic, and commerce, as we see in that image in the middle. And that's what Nat Palmer was involved with, was commerce, most particularly as we get into the 1830s, carrying cotton out of the South, sailing down over those sandbars and bringing cotton back from the north to New York City. Very successful at that. Places like New Orleans here. And I mentioned cotton because we all know of Southern cotton and how important it was. Cotton was king in the South. Cotton was king, I claim, in Mystic, Connecticut. Cotton was king in Stonington, certainly in New York City. 76% of Southern cotton was exported. 50% of the American fleet, domestic and foreign, carried cotton. Without cotton, we would have been a third-rate maritime commercial power. Cotton made us the second most powerful in the maritime commerce on the planet. Here's New Orleans, gives us a sense of that. Another image, moving cotton. This was so vitally important. We can't overstate the importance of cotton for the American economy. And so, nor then can we disengage the growth of New York City, the growth of Stonington, the growth of Mystic, the growth of cities, towns, north and south, to the slave institution. It was absolutely central. But Palmer was sailing, romping across the Atlantic, carrying cotton across, and then on the way back, particularly by the mid-1840s, carrying immigrants, mostly Irish and German. By the way, people freak out about immigrants today. In 1850, 1/3 of the people in Boston were not born in America. In 1850, half of the people in New York City were born abroad. People freak out about the relatively small numbers today. Half the people in New York City, 1850, were foreign born. But New York City survived. America survived. Having succeeded in cotton and the transatlantic trade, in the 1840s, Palmer moves on to the China trade. One of the things he does there is he takes a trip aboard a vessel called the Paul Jones, a so-called clipper ship. On board is William Lowe and his pregnant wife, Anne. William Lowe is a member of A.A. Lowe and Brothers, who are major merchants in Canton. And this poor old vessel, and this is a photograph of her, was very slow, a real slow boat. So Lowe wrote how, quote, to vent his frustration, Captain Nat began carving a block of wood into the shape of what he thought the ideal hull of a Canton trader should look like, one that would outsail anything afloat. So he carves this model of a ship. He comes back and he convinces the Lowe brothers that he has a better way to make clipper ships move fast. First of all clipper ships have an enormous spread of canvas. Look at those sails, or those yards. Look at those masts. Amazing spread of canvas. The more canvas, the faster you go. And the other trick with a clipper ship is to have a speedy hull, one that cuts through the water, with a clipper bow. As you can see, it's a V bow. It's got a V bottom. You can kind of see the shadows. And toward the stern, it angles in very slowly, narrowing in so as not to cause drag. This is the hull of an extreme clipper ship. Problem is, extreme clippers can sacrifice 1/3 of their cargo capacity for speed. That's not good economically. And Palmer says, I've carried cotton across the sandbars of New Orleans and Mobile. I know that a flat-bottom ship can move as quickly as a V-bottom, so he comes up with this idea, and this image shows the difference. The top picture shows what's called the dead rise of an extreme clipper, and the dead rise is the angle of the hull coming off the keel. You can see that's pretty sharp. The bottom image is a Palmer design, a flat-floored clipper. You can see the additional cargo space. Imagine that difference, the whole length of the vessel. And so you could carry tons and tons more cargo, make that much more money. And sure enough, not only could his flat-floored vessel sail as fast as an extreme clipper, but they could go even faster. This is the Hoo-Kwa, designed for the Low Brothers by Nat Palmer, considered by many to be the first true clipper ship. And in fact, his Oriental, this is an image of the Oriental was her name, designed by Palmer, beat the British carriers with tea back to London so badly that as soon as she got in and offloaded, the British government contracted to take her to a shipyard, haul her out, and take her lines, get her dimensions so they could copy it. That's how successful Palmer's ideas were with clipper ship design. And of course, his reputation spread around the world. Here's another vessel. This one happens to be named the N.B. Palmer, and it holds the speed record from Shanghai to New York City, named after Palmer for all of his accomplishments. Probably the most famous vessel he was ever connected with was this, the largest ship in the world at the time, not built or designed by Palmer, but by a guy named Donald Mackay up in East Boston, 1853, half again as long as most vessels, half again as big as most clipper ships. She was actually so big, as we can see, she didn't have 3 masts in this image. You can see she had 4 masts to drive her along. Her name was the Great Republic. And she was such a phenomenon that they closed the schools on launching day in Boston. Thousands of people came down to cheer her. She was launched and then towed to New York City, outfitted, and was being loaded with cargo. Unfortunately, a fire broke out on the waterfront and it burned this beautiful revolutionary clipper ship to the waterline. The Low Brothers bought the wreck and hired Nat Palmer to redesign her. And so the images we see of her as a classic vessel at sea are Palmer's design. He's changed the rig a bit, he's cut it down and yet modernized it. And so she carried on the Great Republic for a 19-year career, thanks to Nat Palmer. And thanks to Nat Palmer, her figurehead, of course, the American eagle, the bald eagle, representing the Great Republic, is here today at the brand new figurehead exhibit at Mystic Seaport Museum. So come on down, folks, if you haven't seen it. It just opened a day or so ago. Palmer now has a worldwide reputation as a master mariner, a designer of fast vessels, an intrepid explorer to the high latitudes. All of this, he's known around the world. He and his brother, Captain Alex, build this mansion down, they name it Pine Point, this beautiful Italianate mansion that is today's headquarters of the Stonington Historical Society. People are welcome to come visit. All sorts of memorabilia of the Palmer brothers. This was their home through their seniority. You can find it. It's very easy to find when you come to Stonington Borough. If you're not from this neck of the woods, that road at the very top, that's Route 1. You hang a right at the Shell station. Come on down, and just before you get to the railroad, a block back is their site. And it's actually, if you look at this map, Quambog Cove, the Palmer Mansion, is right there on that road closest to it, called Palmer Street, of course, and that's where he's located. So he hadn't left town. So he retires from active life, sort of, no longer going to sea, but he designs and helps build 17 yachts. That alone is worth study. That alone is worth a book. And this is what he's doing in his so-called retirement. So he builds these yachts. They race well. He races them himself. Life is generally pretty good. He also likes to go out shooting on Long Island Sound. I don't know if he gathered seabird eggs, but he shot a bunch of them, I assume. And this is how he spent his years of retirement. And then sadness, of course, catches up with all of us. A major blow struck in 1872 when Eliza passed away. And this is Eliza in her maturity. She passes away in 1872. You can find her in the Evergreen Cemetery. I'll show you where that is in a bit. But Eliza Babcock Palmer, 1810, 1872. So his affections then are focused on, he and Eliza were childless, so he focuses on his brother-in-law's son, Captain Alexander's son, Nathaniel Brown Palmer II, known by the family as Natty B. A bright young fellow. Unfortunately, he becomes consumptive. comes down with tuberculosis, which of course in those days was a losing battle. And as his energy began to wane, his uncle Nat took him to China in hopes of a recovery. Off they go. He only gets worse and worse, so they depart Hong Kong bound for home. And only one day out of Hong Kong, young Natty B passes away. Nat Palmer brings the body back to San Francisco, telegraphs his brother, telling him about this horrible loss, and then himself, heartbroken, worn out, played out by this life of his, takes to his bed. And actually, within a very short time, a week or so, Captain Nathaniel Brown Palmer himself fades away, dying in San Francisco, 6 weeks short of his 78th birthday. They bring his body back, and you can visit him up there at the Evergreen Cemetery. Again, look at the very top, in the very center, you can see it says Evergreen Cemetery. That's where Nat Palmer is today. And he's not alone. He's there with Eliza and with Natty B, the three of them lying together. But that's not the end of the legacy of Nathaniel Brown Palmer. His legacy lives on. The U.S. Postal Service has acknowledged it in a stamp. We have the Nathaniel B. Palmer icebreaker, which is used for scientific research. It's down in the Antarctic waters just now, if I get it right. In the lower right, there's clipper ships. Of course, that's part of his legacy. And then at the top right, Palmer Station, one of America's great exploration stations down there in Antarctica. And there's a picture of Steve White and I, when we visited Palmer Station on our wonderful voyage back in January, February. A legacy that lives on, a local boy who's done pretty well, we have to admit. And with that, I thank you all very much.
Thank you, Glenn. We have a few minutes to take some questions from our live and virtual audiences. So if you're online, feel free to use the chat function to send through questions to Crystal. And I'm here to take any questions from our in-person audience members. The question is, to what degree was he involved in the opium trade?
Oh, well, that's a great question because just about everybody was. To be honest, I can't answer that. I do not know. But many Yankee, particularly Boston, Massachusetts, maritime fortunes were based in the opium trade. This is where racism comes in, just like the slavery issue, racism comes in. And it was pretty obvious what was happening to the Chinese public through opium. The British were carrying it back and forth. The Chinese tried to shut that down, and the British actually backed away. But then around the edges of the market, American shipmasters were bringing opium out of Turkey. And so they kept poking at the corners of that opium market, sort of opening the scab. And then eventually the Chinese said that's the end of all of that, and the British, with so much money involved, said, well, maybe we'll just have a war. And so the Opium Wars took place. But I couldn't tell you about Nat Palmer. That's a good question. I don't know. He was a little late in the game, by the way, because he was only over there in 1843. The first Opium War was 1842, so I don't know.
Glenn, a question coming from Maggie in the online audience. What became of Captain Nat's hero?
Yes, good question. She went down south again, but didn't come back. My understanding is that she was, as the term was used, sold foreign, sold to a foreign owner. Maybe by that time a little played out. She'd been built in 1800 and had lived a long and hard life. But her second trip down there, she stayed in the southern hemisphere.
Is the hero's log available online?
Is the hero's log available online? I don't know the answer to that. I would Google it if I was looking. I have my doubts, to be honest, but I don't know.
Another question coming in. Are any of Nat Palmer's vessels still in existence?
No, they're not. All of them have lived their wooden lives and gone the way of all wood and all flesh. We have that wonderful figurehead, but no, these vessels, none of them were designed for longevity. One of the beauties of Mystic Seaport is we give these things longevity. When they're built to last 10, 20 years, we try to hold on to them in perpetuity. That's our task.
Glenn, can you talk a little bit more about the Penal Colony?
Not very much, really. My focus was on Captain Palmer. All I know is that Chile sent its at least some of its criminals to Juan Fernandez, and Palmer just had the misfortune to come ashore when they had just taken the place over. One of the amazing things was, I'll say though, was his presence of mind, where he basically took control of these guys, who again almost killed him on 2 occasions. When he dropped them off on the mainland, they actually cheered him because he had been so sort of kind and humane. But I couldn't tell you any more than that.
A few more questions coming in, Glenn, if you have time. Robert has a question. I understand that Palmer invented the screw propeller and was a founder of the New York Yacht Club. Are either of these true?
I don't think the screw propeller, he may have messed with it. The most famous person connected with that is John Erickson. But there were a lot of people trying to find ways to propel through the water that were better than paddle wheels. And I only know Palmer as a wooden ship designer. I'm kind of looking around the room to see if there's anybody else that knows better than I. I'm getting shaking heads. I'm not aware of that, no.
Okay. Another question. I've heard that Palmer disliked the seal trade. Is this true?
He disliked it?
Right.
I've not read that either, but it would not be a surprise to find that he was sort of repulsed by it, and yet he went back down there on 4 different occasions. So if he was repulsed, perhaps the bottom line and a competency carried the day. Sorry.
Another question coming in from George. Did Nat design any whaling vessels, or did he engage in whaling?
No, he was a proper mariner, so he never went whaling. I always say that the merchant seamen always looked down on the whalers, in spite of the fact that they had to admit that their navigational skills and their endurance were incredible. But Nat Palmer was a merchant seaman proper, and focused on these fine clipper ships that were literally world-class and revolutionary in design.
Great. Lori is wondering, do you think Palmer was as interested in exploration as he was in the hunt?
He was interested in the hunt. His task was to go find product for his shipmates, his colleagues. That's why Powell was so frustrated to get to the South Orkneys. Nobody had ever been there before, and Palmer doesn't even leave his own quarterdeck. So he was definitely, he was a de facto explorer, but he was exploring, looking for product to bring back to the marketplace.
Great. We've got 2 more questions here from the online audience, and then we'll probably end it there. But let's see. Laura is wondering, did Eliza keep a journal of her voyage?
Boy, not that we're aware of. Would that be a gem? Oh, my heavens, I could only imagine. No, we're not aware of any such a document. Boy, maybe in somebody's attic.
All right. And how did Palmer make his money to be able to build the Hero?
Well, he didn't build it. When the Hero, this is interesting. Again, he was a young mariner, and the Hero actually was re-documented with that registration I showed you for this voyage. And any time you change what a vessel's to do from the coastal trade to foreign trade, anytime there's a change in the makeup of the owner cadre, there's re-documentation. When she put to sea out of Stonington for that voyage to Antarctica, there were 19 men that had invested in that very small vessel. They really shared the danger of loss. All local guys, at least as far as I could tell, lots of local names. Nat Palmer was one. He was a small investor, but they took the value of this 47-ton vessel, one little sloop, one master, and spread out the gamble.
Glenn, there is one more question I'll allow to come in. This is from Peggy. Did you come across Captain David Babcock, Eliza's half-brother, captain of the Great Young America?
Oh, I know of Babcock. I didn't include him here. Young America, another classic Yankee clipper ship of great renown. So no, I didn't include him here, but all of these people were exceptional. They were the cream of New England's crop, really, rising to the top of the economy of the society. So yeah, another amazing character.
Great. Thank you so much, Glenn, for this wonderful lecture. So we're going to take a break before our next speaker, Alan Hickey, at 2 o'clock. So thank you to everyone who joined, and thank you, Glenn.
My pleasure. Thank you all.